So a few things to consider here as we get into this. The mindset, right? The mindset of how we approach this time is very, very important, and probably the most important thing that we're going to talk about today. We have to look at this in the long term, right? We'll have to look at this as a long-term career of training. And we want to look at it as a journey, right? It's called 3D muscle journey. It's not called 3D muscle week. I don't know, right? It's a journey. We all know that. That's why we come together, because we all have that mindset. We all have that growth mindset where we want to be in this thing for the long term. And I think that's very, very important that we understand that this is just a blip in time, and it's not going to have too much of an effect in the long term, if any. And we'll get into that, a little bit later. But very key point there. Think more long term rather than short term. Stress. We want to make sure that we're not stressing, right? There's some things that we can control, and there's other things that we can't control. I don't know. I think it's, Alcoholics Anonymous that has that saying where we want to, understand the things that we can change and things that we can't change, and know the difference, or something like that. In other words, put our time and effort and energy into things that we can change, rather than things that we can't change. I totally understand that this is a stressful time, right? We have people losing jobs, people losing lives, people that can't get to the grocery store, right? Just to name a few. Don't let training add on to that. Don't let the impact on your training add to that heavy load that you're already carrying. And that's another thing that I hope that this presentation does, is just help relax you a little bit and realize, okay, training, strength, muscle growth, everything that I've trained for up to this point, not something I have to worry about, right? I want to kind of put your mind at ease a little bit and help relieve any stress that you may have. And that leads us to the next point here, and the beliefs are powerful. Beliefs are very powerful, whether they're true or not. And one of my favorite quotes is actually from Seneca. And he says, we suffer more from imagination than from reality. And it's so true. And if you think about things like, if you have a big exam coming up, and then you are studying and stressing and worrying about this exam for a month maybe, because we don't procrastinate and study at the last minute, right? You study for weeks ahead of the exam. But then, say, for example, the exam gets canceled, or you get exempt from the exam, right, because you have good enough grades going into it. All of that time leading up to the exam, you were suffering in imagination, right? Even like weather, right? So say you have a holiday weekend coming up, right, like Memorial Day, and you look at the weather, and in the weather report, you look 2 weeks out, 2 weeks ahead, and the weather report for the weekend looks rainy, right? Now, you can stress about that and worry about that and get upset about that, but then at the last minute, the weather could change. It could be beautiful, right? It could be gorgeous weather. All that time you suffered in imagination. So when it comes to training and bodybuilding and strength sport, think about things like the post-workout window, right? We all used to think that if we didn't slam that shake with fast digesting whey protein, fast digesting carbs to spike that insulin and get that anabolic response going, if we didn't do that right after training, then our muscles would eat themselves, right? We would kind of just like deteriorate. That was our mindset. That was our belief. And the feelings that came because of that were real. They were real, right? If I forgot my shake, or if I was rushing and couldn't slam that shake after a workout, I would feel anxious, right? I would feel that. That would be a real feeling. I would be short with people who were trying to talk to me. I would be rude almost, right? And in a rush. And that's all from a belief that we know not to be so true anymore, right? So just want to really, really hammer home the point that beliefs are powerful, and just make sure that you're not putting false beliefs in your head. Again, genetics are going to play a huge part in everything that we talk about today, as they always do. The specific goals that you have are going to highly impact this. So if you are training to be a high-level power lifter, that's a different conversation than someone who's just training to stay in shape and build some muscle and burn some fat, right? An Olympic weightlifter is going to have a different conversation than a competitive bodybuilder would during this time, and they're going to have different considerations when taking a break from training and then getting back into it. Nutrition is key, right? Nutrition is key. If we're going to be talking about hypertrophy and muscle loss, obviously nutrition matters when it comes to that stuff, right? You have to make sure that you have a good nutrition plan in there. And Steve from 3DMJ is, the place to go for that. So make sure that we're eating in a, caloric deficit or caloric surplus, depending on what our goals are. Because no matter what we do, if we're not, focusing on our nutrition, it's probably not going to help us when it comes to, hypertrophy or gaining muscle, losing muscle. The other thing that we have to talk about is time completely off versus time with modified training. A lot of the studies that look at this stuff deal with time completely off, okay? And that's a difference. That's a big difference from what we're doing. Most of us are doing something, right? Most of us are doing some kind of modified training at our houses, in our yards, in a park, if you're Eric Helms. So the difference between time completely off and time with just modified training is very, very important. So we're going to see in the studies that we dive into, after time completely off, people lost minimum amount of size and minimum amount of strength. So by adding in some training during that period, it's only going to make it better for us, right? And also, we're not talking about bed rest either. So the studies that we talk about in this presentation, not bed rest. So there's time completely off, which is just a normal person who's getting up, walking around, going to the store, driving, getting up and down stairs, but not training, right? Then there's bed rest, where it's someone who's just in bed 24/7. Very, very different. Those two things are very different. We're not talking about bed rest here. Bed rest has a host of other issues that come with it. So keep in mind, we're not talking about bed rest. The next point, and again, another thing that we can kind of take comfort in, is untrained individuals versus intermediate and advanced. A lot of the studies that we're going to be looking at deal with time completely off, like we just said, but also untrained individuals. So the reason for that is because how many intermediate to advanced trainees would raise their hand and go into a study that says we're going to train for 6 weeks, then we're going to take 3 months off completely, no working out, and then start up a program again? I wouldn't join that study. Well, I wouldn't want to not train for 3 months, right? So they get novices, right, and untrained individuals to do these studies usually. So again, in these studies that have time completely off and untrained individuals, there's still a modest decrease in size and strength, which we'll get into. So imagine someone who's an intermediate and advanced and hasn't been taking time completely off, has still been training a little bit. All those things we have going for us, okay? Just going to take a drink of water here. All right. And the last things we want to keep in mind are what we were doing before the layoff, what our training looked like before the layoff, what our modified training looked like during the layoff. Those two things are going to be very, very important when it comes to kind of getting back into this. And we'll get into that with our little bit of a case study at the end. All right. So you may be asking, why the Mask of Zorro? Sorry, I wanted to get another drink there. Why the Mask of Zorro? In this movie, I saw it when I was younger, watched it in the movie theater behind my hands because I was so afraid, and but I ended up loving it after that. There's a scene where Anthony Hopkins is like the old Zorro, and Antonio Banderas is the up and coming new Zorro. Antonio Banderas is a bit of unconventional, like just wants to get revenge, doesn't know how to, the technique of using a sword, and he just wants to get in there and learn how to be Zorro so he can get revenge on someone in the movie, right? He grabs a sword. Anthony Hopkins is trying to help him and train him, and on the first day, Antonio Banderas grabs a sword, and Anthony Hopkins is just sitting there in the beautiful, beautiful way that Anthony Hopkins has about him, right? And he looks at him and says, "Do you even know how to use that thing?" And Antonio Banderas looks at the sword and goes, "Of course." He goes, "The pointy end goes in the other man." And Anthony Hopkins is just like, "Oh, yeah. This is going to take a while." So I put that picture in there because that's how I feel a lot of us are going to be when the gym doors open, right? Gym doors open. We're just so happy that they're open. We walk in there and then it's like, wait, we don't have a plan, right? We have to have some kind of plan here. We can't just say, "Oh yeah, the pointy end goes in the other man." We can't just say, "Oh, there's a barbell. I know how to squat. I'm going to just get in there and start doing my thing." So very, very important there to kind of have a plan, right? And that's what we're doing here. So the concept of graded exposure is very popular in physical therapy treatment, and it's kind of what I base most of my treatment around. It's the idea that we want to kind of gradually expose the body to a certain stimulus. And by doing that, by exposing the body to the edge of discomfort of something, whatever it is, by doing that over and over and over again, you will almost desensitize the system and allow the body to adapt, right? So, for example, an example I use all the time is September 11th, right? So, like I said before, I am in New Jersey. I've lived in New Jersey my whole life. I could see the skyline of New York City from my, if I drive 30 seconds from my house. Very close to us. So after September 11th, and to this day, many of us, not only in my area, but in the world, can't just simply see a low-flying plane and it just be a low-flying plane, right? There's always going to be a feeling of unease when we see something like that. However, that stimulus of the low-flying plane gives us that response, which is that anxious, uneasy feeling. If I worked at an airport and I saw planes flying over my head all day long for 8 hours, my body would not get that response every time a plane flew over my head. The idea is that by working at an airport, I have gradually exposed myself to that stimulus, and my body has adapted to it. So the stimulus is objectively the same, but my point of reference is different. So I was able to adapt. Similar thing if, say, for example, I'm afraid of spiders. I wouldn't, because you have to do it gradually. If you overshoot too much, then you can cause pain and injury, right? So in my spider example, if I'm afraid of spiders, if you throw me into a pool of tarantulas, which is absolutely terrifying, I am going to freak out so badly that I may never, ever, ever, ever be able to even look at any kind of insect for the rest of my life. That's injury. We went too hard, too fast. If, however, we start with one spider on the other side of the room, I may get a little bit of that anxiety feeling. But as I sit, I breathe in, breathe out, let my body get accustomed to that. Then maybe I move a bit closer to the spider. Same process. My heart may race, I may start sweating. Relaxed. My body gets accustomed to that. Then I move closer and closer, and then pretty soon I am standing right next to that spider, and I'm not quite getting that response, right? I gradually expose myself to it. Objectively, it's the same stimulus, but my body has adapted to it, okay? That's the idea of graded exposure. We don't want to do too much, too fast. We want to gradually expose our bodies to it to give it time to adapt. The next concept we're going to talk about is the repeated bout effect. The repeated bout effect basically says that the more we do something, the easier it becomes, okay? And it's a protective mechanism that our body has developed. So think about the first time that you drove a car. You're probably very tense in the shoulders, in the arms, in the hands, very mentally fatiguing, right? You're thinking about all these different things. You could drive around the block and be physically exhausted, right? Be mentally exhausted and sweating from your right, and you're just like, man, that was fatiguing. That was tiring. As we drive more and more, now we can drive around the block and not even know that we're driving, right? We could be thinking about something completely different, and not even realize we're driving. It's our body's protective mechanism. If we do something new and novel for our bodies, the body's going to be on guard at first because we don't know if it's safe, we don't know if it's dangerous. As we keep doing it, it's not advantageous for our bodies to put that much resource into our upper traps and our arms and our hands and our minds as we're driving, right? Doesn't make sense. There are other places to put those resources. So it kind of decreases that response. It decreases the muscle damage and fatigue, so to speak, as we keep doing it more and more. And that is the key concept when it comes to returning after a layoff. Because as we get back into this, we're going to start very low, right? We're going to start very low. What we'll find is that even low training, or, I say low training, even very light training, can elicit that repeated bout effect. So the studies that we're going to talk about, even something as low as 10% of maximal voluntary contraction, which is not much, even 10% elicited that repeated bout effect and allowed for less fatigue and less muscle damage down the road as loads and volume progressed. Okay, so that's a key concept there, is that even with low loads, as long as we're doing something, we're eliciting that repeated bout effect, and it's going to have a protective effect on us down the road as we get into our heavier training. Think of it like this. I've shot archery since I was like 3 years old. I haven't shot in maybe 4 years or so. I was very good before, I took 4 years off. I'm sure if I pick up a bow and arrow, I won't be where I was, with skill level. I'd be pretty darn good though. As I kept doing it and started practicing again, I would gain that last bit of percentage up to 100 much, much faster than I did the first time around. Okay? So it has this protective mechanism, but it also allows us to regain what we've lost faster than the first time around. This is very important because when we talk about overshooting or undershooting, right? When you have the angel and the devil on your shoulder and the one is telling you, come on, you could do more, you could do more, you could do more. And the other's telling you, maybe just hang out here for a little bit. No need to rush it. It's always better to undershoot than overshoot when returning from a layoff. Because if we undershoot, the repeated bout effect will still happen. And we'll get that protective mechanism moving forward when we progress. That's the only thing that can happen when we undershoot, right? If we overshoot, we're going to have increased fatigue, increased soreness, and that's going to decrease our future performance. And when we're talking about these things in the long term, that's what matters, right? We don't want to just put all of our effort into one training session and then it knocks out the effectiveness or the performance of the rest of the week. We don't want to do that. We want to elicit that repeated bout effect, but come in like a lion every time we train, right? Consistently. That's what this is going to help with. So if we undershoot, we're going to get that repeated bout effect. If we overshoot, we're going to increase fatigue, increase soreness, maybe even injury, right? And we don't want any of those things. So always better to undershoot when we're coming back from a layoff. And always remember that preparation is protective. Okay, so these low loads kind of working into it is protective. Okay, we're preparing and it's going to protect us. And we want to find that sweet spot, right? We want to find that sweet spot of that moving bell curve that we talked about. So again, we want to always kind of lean to the side of undershooting, but we don't want to not do anything, right? And we don't want to do too much. So I'm talking to the person who was like me, who has the tendency to do too much. But there are people that have the tendency to do too little, and they are waiting for any excuse to do little. So if they hear me say always undershoot, that may not be good advice for them. They may have to be pushed a little bit more. So I'm talking in referencing someone who has the tendency to overshoot. But remember that it's a bell curve. So you don't want to be too low, you don't want to be obviously too high. And the timeline here that we're talking about with returning from this layoff should be about as long as the layoff. So if you were 3 months without the gym, the idea is that it would probably take about that to get back or surpass where you were. However, remember that estimation comes from those studies that dealt with time completely off and with novice lifters. So if you're experienced and you've built up that, like the archery example, you've built up over years that skill, and you're doing some modified training at home, I think you could shorten that time period. Okay, so there's just a kind of estimate.